Yeah, the whole 72, 73, 74, around that time, that whole Jesus movement started with Larry Norman and Phil Keaggy, Maranatha, the whole thing in California. So that was
Right.
already happening here, but I didn't know about it because I was still wet behind the ears about Christianity.
So let's
Uh,
talk about the Jesus. Well, okay, first of all, is that basically your testimony ever since then, before we get into the Jesus movement, you were transformed. In other words, you were changed. You had this, like, as the Bible says, a transformed mind. You started looking at things differently. Did you continue to get high at that point?
I'm glad you said that because that first year of being saved, I still kept smoking pot. So I remember Louis Nazario said to me, Mike, he was a pastor of this church, the hippie church, and he said, you don't have to keep smoking pot anymore. I go, oh, I didn't know. And because it's so innocent, that's the thing that I loved about back then, that there wasn't this, try to straighten out you morally immediately type of thing that goes on sometimes in churches now. It was more like, hey man, you don't have to do that anymore. I'm like, okay, I don't have to do that anymore. It was
Yeah.
very innocent. Um, and not that I wanted to smoke pot. It was just that that's what everybody did, so you did it, kind of like deal.
Right.
And I like that. I miss that about that. They call it the first love. So you
Hmm.
first get saved and you have that first love with Jesus. I miss that because we don't have that. I don't see that in church anymore. But then again, I can't expect that what happened in the 70's to go on now because God is always evolving.
He's
So
changing.
bad word, not evolving. God is always transforming
Yes.
us,
Right.
because God isn't into evolution. God is more into transforming us like a
Yeah, we don't want to
butterfly.
confuse. We don't want to confuse our. No, I think no. I understand what you're saying completely. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, God is always doing something new, something unique, different. But
Exactly.
let's talk about the Jesus movement, because I don't know too much about the subject. I'm not sure how much listeners know about the subject. Is my whole concept of this is from, like, watching movies and documentaries about these flower children. And we used to joke around when I was in summer camp. There's this kid, these two kids, who they, like, hung out all together all the time, and they had longish hair, and everyone used to call them flower children.
Oh, flower children. Yeah.
And that was a big deal, and that's my whole, like, understanding of what things were like back then. I mean,
Yeah.
but what
That
was
did
it
go
like?
on, though. Yeah. That was the true hippies. The Jesus movement came out of the hippie movement.
It did, right? I mean,
Yeah.
isn't that the whole thing with the putting the little flowers in the machine gun barrels and stuff?
Yep. I remember that early. I was probably like 10 years old. I remember seeing the first in the South Bronx where I grew up. I remember starting to see the hippies coming out, sandals, ripped up clothes because they kind of like lived on, living off the land type of thing.
Right.
And I was on the subways and the buses, and my parents were very upset about that. That was like a no-no. I didn't get it, I didn't get it. I just thought it was just part of life, when you're a kid, it's all about life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I do remember that. I remember my neighbor having a Volkswagen and him painting it and putting a flower on it, excuse me, on the outside of the thing. And kind of like thought that was odd. But then at the same time, we were listening to the Beatles. The Beatles have started coming out with Strawberry Fields Forever and the White Album and all that, what I call psychedelic music was coming out.
Uh huh.
But that was 60's into the 70's. So things were kind of like changing. America was changing. Society was changing.
But people don't know what you just said. That's a very important thing. I want to repeat that. You said that the Jesus movement came out of the hippie movement, and that's
Yeah.
when the Beatles were popular. And um, first of all, I mean, was Jimmy Carter president then? I mean, the country was in this, like, malaise, economic downturn, right?
Yeah, Jimmy Carter had become president in the 70's, like 72, 73, if I remember right. Maybe 74, I can't remember. I remember Nixon being the president. Um, I want to call it the rebellion, was going on back then because everybody was anti-war. Nobody wanted to be in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and, I thank God for every vet that fought in Vietnam. I have friends. I was younger, but they were older that had gone over and came back and were just all screwed up because the draft was going on. But I know a lot of guys that joined anyway. They believed in America. They believed in, you know, fighting communism. So yeah, that was going on. No question about it.
I mean, yeah, but the Jesus movement was so the hippie movement birthed the Jesus movement, and then you're telling me that the Jesus movement was more of a youth. It sounds like it was more of a youth thing. Like if you're a young person who was involved in the music and the culture, like did it birth like a new type of gospel worship music, or what are the some of the things that came out of it?
Well, I remember when I first got saved, there was a record company called Word Records, because there's only two ways to get Christian music. You either went to the Christian bookstore or you ordered it online. And back then it was vinyls. Don't remember there being 8 tracks, but anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, the first thing I know about the Jesus movement was that it was, if I remember right, it was happening in Costa Mesa, California. And Chuck Smith had started a church. And so a lot of hippies are coming to that church. And out of that church came out bands like Love Song. And a bunch of artists came out of that. And that was happening in California. And
Okay.
I think from what I remember, it was that even though people were getting high in the hippie movement and stuff like that, they still were empty. You know, because let's face it, drugs ain't going to fill you up. All the booze, all the sex, it's not going to satisfy you. You know, you either burn out or you die. So I know people were searching. And I remember, if I recall right, people were hanging out at that church. I think it was, what was the name of that church? I know it was in Costa Mesa, California. Chuck Smith and Chuck Gerard, those kind of artists coming out that time. And they gave way to what is known now as Maranatha. Well, I don't even know if Maranatha even exists anymore, but you know, record labels like Maranatha and churches like Maranatha type of worship. When I got saved,
Yeah.
the music is not what it is. It wasn't what it is today. So you had artists like Phil Keaggy, even Amy Grant back then when she was like 16, she had put out a record. You had artists like Honey Tree.
Wasn't Whitney Houston also she was a Christian singer in the very beginning? That's from Whitney Houston.
I think Whitney was more in the 80s.
But that was the 80s, right? Yeah.
80s, yeah.
We'll get into the 80s. Well, here's my take is that the Jesus movement, as you said, came out of the hippie movement. So a lot of people were searching for meaning. They were trying to figure out why drugs and sex and rock and roll and stuff were not satisfying their deep innate desires, it sounds like. And then they started to search for God, and God was answering them, and people were getting saved out of it. That's what it sounds like to me. And then in the 80s, we all know that the 80s was this resurgence of like faith and conservatism, and like we had a strong economy. And I think that correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe this whole Jesus movement in the 70s gave birth to this economic machine in the 80s, and this like resurgence of these traditional values, conservative values. What do you think?
Well, it looks like when the 80s started, I remember this because I was already starting to play music by then. There was 2 segments of Christian music. There was contemporary Christian music. Well, actually 3. There was contemporary Christian music, traditional worship music, and then you had Christian alternative artists. So Christian radio started growing at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, because Christian radio started growing, thus there was a market. So people took advantage, obviously, investors, and they created Christian record companies and Christian labels. And then within the cortex of those Christian labels were contemporary Christian music artists and rock artists and heavy metal artists. And you know, it's almost like mimicking what was going on in the secular world. And so, yeah, we saw that happening. I saw that happening. And of course, along with that type of success comes money. And so I would say the whole 80s, from 80 to like 1989, you saw that growth of music. But then there was the anti-Christian music establishment. And I know what that's like because I remember toward the end when I first got saved in 77, you were not allowed to go into certain churches with bell bottoms and long hair. That was like a no-no. You couldn't even get on the premises, man. And
What?
so we were getting persecuted by the church.
Oh man, isn't that
And that,
typical? That is the typical problem because honestly, I see that happening all the time. The church is its own enemy.
oh
It's
my God, it was insanity. It was insanity. And then in the 80s, like you said, you had the moral majority. And so they were, I'll never forget this because in the 80s, there was this thing called Hell's Bells. And it was a guy, I don't remember what his name was, but he did like sermons and uh, like teachings on how, backmasking albums, and it was devils in the records. It was like insanity. It was insane. It was insane.
let's get it more into that in a second. Let's take a break. We're talking to Kruz. Kruz is a Christian artist, alternative Christian artist. He's been in the music scene since the 90s and even earlier than that. We're going to talk about why musicians are not making money in the industry anymore, why there isn't any good music that's coming out anymore. We're going to get into all that. By the way,
Yeah.
as we go to break, let's try to fix your Skype because it kind of froze a little bit. So I'll get you to call back. If you can hang up, call back, and we'll get that set up. All right?
Okay, got it.
Okay, we'll be back, guys, right after this.
Don't accept that is a truism. I accept that inductive reasoning would lead us to believe that that's most probably true, but we cannot assert absolutely that it is impossible for something to come from nothing because there is no way to examine and test that.
No. That's baloney. It doesn't make sense.
You take any prescribed medication, sir?
Rob